Ladies and gentlemen, friends and colleagues, welcome to the Europe House in Helsinki. A very important seminar awaits you, but as the head of the European Parliament Liaison Office here in Helsinki, I just want to thank Parliament Magazine. I just want to thank Parliament Magazine and the European Movement International for suggesting this seminar to be organized in cooperation with our office. This would be an excellent seminar at any point in time, any date, any time, but obviously this particular time with the approaching European elections, this is a particularly opportune moment to discuss the future of Europe. On the 26th of April, in a little bit more than 1 month, European Parliament will have the last day of its last legislative plenary for this term, and we can say that it has been very much distinguished by a very high-profile and ambitious legislative agenda, and obviously the fact that that we have a war going on in Europe following Russia's war of aggression is putting a particular focus on the security aspects of the Union going forward. In 67 days, if I'm correct, Finland will start early voting, and I think it's 75 days to the time when the Netherlands starts opening the polls and people start voting there, and I think 79 days to the day and time when Italy will be the last country to close the polls on Sunday, the 9th of June. The slogan for European Parliament's institutional campaign for the European elections is "Use your vote." And for once, this actually in translation has a very nice double meaning in Finnish. Translations usually are not very good in this kind of institutional context, but "use your vote," käytä ääntäsi, it means in Finnish both use your voice and use your vote. And so now you have about 65 days here in Finland to find your voice and use your vote before the 9th of June. Thank you very much, and I wish you a very pleasant seminar. All the best.
Good afternoon. My name is Christopher Alessi, and I'm the editor of the Parliament Magazine. And I thank you for joining us all here in Helsinki today for the Finnish edition of our series, Road to the European Elections, which is co-organized by the Parliament Magazine and the European Movement International, along with the kind support of the European Parliament Liaison Office in Finland. As European elections fast approach, the upcoming months will force EU lawmakers to wrestle with a host of key policy decisions. Chief among them is the issue of European security and defense, which is expected to be a top part of the agenda for the new mandate. And the key question that looms is whether and how the European Union can enhance its security and defense capabilities and play a bigger role within NATO amid a raft of international threats. We'll unpack that question today during 2 panel discussions. But first, I'm supposed to remind you that participants both on site and online can ask questions on Slido by scanning that QR code on the screens right there, or by typing in the code #1427067 on the Slido website. So without further ado, allow me to introduce our speakers joining us for today for the first panel, the Future of European Security and Defense Policy. And forgive me in advance if I butcher any names. But we have here Jonas Sederlöf, who is a policy officer for the European Commission's Directorate General for Defense, Industry and Space. Then Tytti Tuppurainen, a member of the Finnish Parliament and former Minister of European Affairs. Juha Jokela, Program Director at the Finnish Institute of International Affairs, Aku Arva, Board Member at European Movement International, and last but not least, Sirpa Pietikäinen, who is a member of the European Parliament and sits on the Economics Committee. But before delving into the debate, I'd like to welcome Maria Blazer, head of the delegation for the Representation Office of the European Commission in Finland, who will provide an overview of the recently announced and unprecedented European Defense Industrial Strategy. Welcome, Maria.
Thank you very much. So, dear panelists and dear participants both here and online. Yes, we're going to speak today about European security and defense policy. It's a very timely subject. It's been debated yesterday by the EU leaders in Brussels at the European Council summit meeting. And of course, the reason why we are discussing these issues is quite obvious. Ever since Russia launched its war of aggression against Ukraine, the EU has remained steadfast in its support for Ukraine's not only independence but also sovereignty and territorial integrity. And the EU is determined to provide Ukraine with all kinds of assistance, including also with military assistance, for as long as it takes. Yet at the same time, we have encountered another issue that we have to deal with, and that is to have a look in the more longer perspective how to strengthen Europe's own defense industry. And that is precisely what the Commission had in mind when a few weeks back it proposed a first ever European defense industry strategy. In the past, we've had all kinds of initiatives in this field, but for the first time, what we want to do is to have a more holistic approach. And in recent days, we have, surely in Finland, but also in Brussels, we've been talking about a holistic approach, not least when Commission President invited Sauli Niinistö to report on a whole of society approach to make the EU more resilient and prepared for crisis. But what is the European defense industry all about? Among other things, it's about strengthening European defense technological and industrial base, also increasing defense readiness. And the question is then, how would the member states do that? Well, the first thing is to substantially increase the national defense expenditure. There are also many other measures that can be done. For instance, improve the European defense industry's access both to public and private finance. Here again, there are many different ways of doing that, but one which is being debated and was also debated by the European leaders is whether there should be a change in the European Investment Bank's lending policy and also allow financing in this field. Then there are incentives that we want to give to joint procurement. We want to strengthen the resilience of the European defense industry, etc., etc. I won't go into all of the details because my colleague Jonas Cederlöf can go deeper into this matter if need be. But obviously we can't do any of this without money. And the question then is, what would this cost? Well, for the time being, what the Commission has proposed is that there would be an initial funding portion for a 2-year period starting from next year, which is 1.5 billion euros. I assume that the panelists might debate whether this is sufficient. It probably won't. It's a rather modest sum, but the debate about how to increase the funding and how to do it is only starting now. So the strategy is above all an industrial strategy which aims to develop the EU's defense market, among other things. And what we want to see is a bottom-up strategy. And what is at stake? Well, nothing less than European security order and a way to combat, for instance, the aggression of Russia. And now the next step is that it's up to the member states to respond to the Commission's proposals. I look forward to the discussion by the panelists, and thank you very much.
Thank you, Maria, for that very helpful overview. As has been noted, the defense strategy comes as Russia's war of aggression rages in Ukraine and as Putin's tactics and rhetoric grow increasingly belligerent. It also comes amid a growing current of isolationism in the United States, the traditional guarantor of European security. As a result, it's perhaps never been more important for the EU to strengthen its own defense and security capabilities. So I'd like to ask each of you, given the overview we just heard, to weigh in on whether and how this new industrial strategy sets the EU up for taking greater control of its own security, and whether the strategy allows the EU to plug its defense capacity gaps. Jonas, would you mind beginning?
Thank you for giving me the opportunity to kick this off, and my beginning will be very short, of course, because thank you, Maria, that was a very comprehensive overview of the defense industry strategy. And Maria already kind of pointed out, no, this is not enough. We all know this is not enough. But then again, looking at where we come from, it's still unprecedented and unheard of the manner in which we, from an institutional European approach, support this. Having said that, we still adhere to rules and regulations and indeed also fundamental principles. So although we speak, just as a reminder here, although we speak of a lot of money or funds and weapons, at no point is any of the other institutions, I mean the Commission is never going to procure weapons. That's not something that's going to happen here. So it's all the time, it's support to the member states and how they perform this. But we all know this is not enough. The figures that have been flying around, both by esteemed member state heads of state and Commissioner Breton, the 500 billion euro defense investment fund is like a minimum where we would come up to a level where we would somehow be in the ballpark of having enough resilience against an aggressor, a peer aggressor like the tyrannic Russia. So that's where we are. 500 billion would be the start, and that would be to support the member states. Then we have Ukraine separately. Now, I don't want to exhaust all the air here in the room, and I would be happy to give forward, but this is just to point out the magnitude where we are. But still, 1.5 billion, it's a good start. It's following on what we are currently doing. It will not save Ukraine.
Thank you. Tati, do you want to weigh in?
I'd like to start by pointing out that the European Union is the greatest peace project in the world. It has received Nobel Peace Prize. And we have to keep that in mind, but also respond to current challenges. And there's an old Roman saying that if you want peace, prepare for war. Parabellum. So I find this initiative of European defense industrial strategy as very timely and needed. We need to speed up and ramp up our defense industrial production. And this initiative, it is a good start. I think it's not sufficient, but it's a good start. We have to also keep in mind that, especially when we come from Finland, we are a fresh NATO member state, that NATO is an organization of collective defense. It is the organization of deterrence. And EU is something else. And it has to be kept as something else. So these two entities in a perfect world would add to each other. And having also Sweden in NATO now brings these two institutions or organizations, if you like, closer to each other. It helps to complement each other and find added value. So NATO has its own task, and EU can also develop its own actions, having all the possible tools in the toolbox. Diplomacy, in particular, I would like to point out.
Thank you. Coming from a research community, so I think what we observed and what we were hoping after the Russia's aggression on Ukraine we saw that the defense spending went up in the member states. Many member states announced big sums. I think Germany is one of those who have been most vocal on that. There's been a kind of 2 years now, and we've been pondering when this will be reflected or when this is radiated to the European defense cooperation. And I think now the defense industry strategy is one element of that. But I think still we see very little movement. Europe or EU member states, they spent 270 billion on defense. This is the figure from 2023. And when we look the years before that, so we can see that only 18% of that spending is coming from a collaboration between the member states. So I think there is a great room to improve that, and this is something what has been lacking behind. And when one hears figures like 1.5 billion, it's a good start. It still doesn't reflect, I think, the kind of the reality there, because there is quite a lot of spending. So I think there are a lot of these structural issues at play as well, member states' interests at play as well, which still prevents this kind of more efficient cooperation and integration. I think it's also important for European Union to keep in mind that although we are discussing here now the defense industry side of it, so the world is changing and European Union has decided to enlarge. Many of those countries now starting the accession process have huge security problems. Obviously Ukraine is at war, there are Russian troops in Georgia, then we have all these frozen conflicts. When European Union last time enlarged, it went in a way that NATO enlarged first and then the Union. Now I don't know whether that will be a possibility this time. So I think this also requires the Union to take much more seriously the security and defense of its neighborhood and the countries accessing the European Union. This is also one thing where there's quite a strong consensus among the research community that this kind of a gray zone created between Russia and the European Union after the last enlargement was a kind of a part of the reason what we're now seeing in Europe. The war has returned to Europe.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Well, first I have to say I agree with all the speakers before me that this is a good start. But I almost must say this is not enough, not by far. We're in a situation where Russia has now moved or is transitioning into a full war economy. And we know the situation. We must think, or we must change our thinking towards buy European. We need to be, strategic about it. We need to ensure that our industries are able to provide the tools and the means to protect our values, to protect our freedom. And I'm a bit worried that we are not progressing as fast as we should. A good start, but we need to amp up a lot. And I've said this before, I'm going to say it again, the appeasement policies, they didn't stop Hitler in the Second World War. I doubt it will stop Putin now. I don't want a war with Russia, of course. I don't want the war to expand, but I definitely don't want to see it happen on Russia's terms. And this means that we need to be ready. We need to have enough deterrent against Russia, and it won't happen if we don't have the industry to do it. And this is where I would start. A good start, but we need to move forward.
Thank you.
Well, I see that there's two aspects. The first aspect is that we should always bear in mind the bigger picture. And the bigger picture is the large security issue. We are talking about food security, medicine security, health security, social security, the rule of law, many of the things that actually are basis of the security. And the point is that if we sort of focus too much only one side, be it social security or military, defense security, then whatever is the weakest link is going to break the whole chain. And the risk what I'm seeing here is that we always talk about nowadays more and more, as we have to, about the military security. and we set aside the other aspects of strategic autonomy and security. And that's why I'm going to sort of repeat this always, whatever I say, because put it in the context is very important. In this context, of course, the other leg for the military security is the preparedness strategy that the former President Niinistö is preparing. So Europe never should be left unguarded or unprepared, whatever happens. That, by the way, goes to climate change and many other things, and not only Russia. So we shouldn't sort of focus too narrowly either, because if we stare in one point and the threat comes from the another, we are in as bad situation. But then, okay, about the defense and defense union, that is very dear topic to me. EU is a bit like a luxurious dinner. Everybody wants to take part and participate, but no one wants to pay the bill. And this is the problem with this defense union too. And I'm now linking it to the fact that actually you do not stop buying the food and giving the food for the kid because you need to buy the medicine, the acute crisis for the kid. And the risk now is, and we are seeing it already in our budgets and our debates, we say, okay, you need to act with the Russia and with the defense. What do? You cut from the research, you cut from the other areas, you see a backlash in many parts of the politics that actually would strengthen the European Union. And this is something that should be no-go. It is either the member states ineffectively by themselves that need to prepare the ammunition, prepare the fighters, prepare the troops, and that definitely costs more than if we do it together. Then member states need to pay for it, and that needs to be crystal clear. Of course, yes, we can put 1 billion or whatever is the figure. But if we talk about this 500 billion figures in longer run, that needs to come from member states. Personally, I would like to prefer to have this the defense fund, but this probably won't go as a part of the EU budget. It can't be only by the member states' independent structure. But anyway, it should be primarily financed by the member states, and as we know, we are in the long road on effective European Union and our decision making as it is, as we know, with the veto rights and Hungary and Ukrainian support and all these stories. So how do you make this happen? I really don't know. But this is something that the public should debate in all of the member states and send the message to the governments, come on, you need to pay for this, or you pay even more. And then probably we talk about that, and I think we should talk much more about the efficacy. We would have one of the biggest armies in the world if we would have been united. It's far more cost effective if we would joint procure all our fighters, airplanes, ships, equipment for the troops. And we definitely need this kind of an Airbus initiative to develop high skill needed capacity. Otherwise, we would never have been sort of able to create a competitor for Boeing. And look what we are doing for fighters at the moment, for example. It's so sad story. So we are kicking in our own feet.
Well, thank you. So broad agreement that it's a good start, but not nearly enough. I'd be remiss if I didn't ask you, Jonas, to weigh in on this topic of joint procurement. Is that a possibility? I'm supposed to have one here. Yeah. Can you hear me? Or okay.
Not really.
No? Okay. I'll project a bit more.
Yeah, you need to roll with the chair more and look the same way. Yeah. Okay. Thank you. That was straight pass to me, very appreciative. This is, of course, one of our favorite themes over at our side, and there is, of course, some paperwork also to support the claim that when you pool the demand, you achieve efficiencies and effectiveness and efficacy, I think you said. And then you would also pool the supply. But we need to have in mind two principles here. The economy of scale is something that people over at industrial management and production economy have heard more than once. But it's a term used or coined by the producer. It's not the one who is buying that benefits typically from economy of scale. It's usually the one who produces, and that's where it stems from. But we need to see that still as what it is. And there is something there, and we have shown and we have clear evidence that it has also an impact for the ones who are buying. So pooling of supply, pooling of demand has fundamentally an effect. But I would say that even more than only on the price, the bigger impact is on the security of supply. And here I again look at Sirpa, because that was a fundamental point. It's a really a base of the preparedness union that Finland is advocating with a good effort, I think, and we wish that will continue. But security of supply, for that you need a pooled demand, because only through that the smaller member states can be certain of having access to critical material. And that's really, you cannot even put a price on it. So that's something that I would like to underline. And that's in fact one of the main efforts we are pushing forward here in the new program. You may say that the 1.5 billion, it leans a lot of what is already out there, but the security of supply aspect of it is something I would like to highlight, and it's a new entry here. Whole of society approach, indeed, we are not just focusing on the defense side, but one could only agree to it and remind us of the difference between EU and NATO. NATO is also very resilience approaching organization, but when NATO speaks of resilience, it's resilience for the military. But when we speak of resilience, we speak of resilience for all, including the military. So happy to support NATO, that's what we like to say.
I wanted to actually jump off that because Tutti had drawn the distinction between NATO and the EU. And I'm curious to hear your thoughts on, given recent NATO expansion, including, of course, Finland and Sweden now, what role the EU should play in that security alliance, especially given that it's been so long dominated by the US?
Well, first of all, it's actually striking what happened after Russia invaded Ukraine. It was self-destructive for Putin. The consequences were totally different than what he expected. He wanted to create spheres of interest and, of course, invade Ukraine, but what he got was enlargement of NATO and other things, including Denmark giving up its opt-out in European defense policies and so on. So what he achieved is actually an amazing unity of the whole West and especially of the European Union. And no matter how much doubt there has been, and of course there has been a lot of problems as well, we have been able to remain united. And that is also what matters when it comes to the United States and our message to the White House and the House in the States, that we have to remain united. And by showing our example, we could perhaps encourage the United States Congress also to make decisions and resolve and stay steadfast in its support for Ukraine. Now, NATO and EU, as I said, they are different, but I believe the EU and Europe as such, we have all the reason to strengthen our capabilities also when it comes to defense and security. All the reasons, for our own sake. We need to do that because we have seen what Russia is able to do. It's the war in Europe, as you have pointed out. It's a devastating idea to think that there's an imperialistic authoritarian regime that is waging war in Europe. We have to take that seriously and develop our own capabilities. And that is actually what the United States expects from us. Many people see that the United States might somehow be jealous if we would develop our own capabilities, but that's not the case. If we look at what are the messages of President Trump or Biden administration, they both are saying it's a bipartisan message that we have to do our homework here in the EU. So for our own sake, we need to invest in our capabilities, and for the United States, we have to do that. And that would be the favor to our citizens, because we have to contain Russia, as Aku rightly said. I also don't believe that appeasement works. Unfortunately, it does not work. Russia's intentions are clearly outspoken. Putin has said it many times, and he has kept on threatening us with nuclear weapons and so on. We have to take that seriously and develop our own capabilities and remain united and show that will also prevail.
Juha, would you like to weigh in on EU's role in NATO?
Yes. Maybe I continue where Tytti left it, and the kind of the I think there's a clear role for the European defense industrial strategy also to support NATO's capability developments. And this is also something where things changed maybe already 10 years ago. The talk from Washington, the worries about the duplication between EU and NATO, they withered away. But surprisingly, they came back during Trump administration in one of the Munich security conferences, and we were wondering why did they came back. And I think then it started to look like that the European defense cooperation is actually leading somewhere. Germany and France were very much on the opinion that if we spend more, we buy European. And then the Americans find it a little bit difficult to digest in a way that Europeans don't buy any more American. And I think this is something what might come again to the discussion when these plans are developing further. And of course, it's a big debate then, and there are big interest at stake. But then I think also when you look at the EU and NATO, I think of course there is huge differences, and many of those have been already pointed out here. I think the most important one is the resilience side and the comprehensive security, what has mentioned. So obviously NATO and EU, they support each other's in that sphere. NATO doesn't have a European Parliament or Council which can legislate on resilience, how to safeguard, guarantee critical infrastructure or build societal resilience and so forth. EU can do that. And of course, many of the policy fields of the EU are very, very important here. Then there's a more sort of a defense field where I also see that the kind of the division of labor is clarified, and that is international operations, especially crisis management, both civilian and military one. We all know that there is not much appetite for new operations after Afghanistan, but if we look what goes on around Europe, we just look at our southern neighborhood, for instance. So I think there might be, quite a big demand for crisis management operations, and obviously everybody would now look at the EU's role, EU's capabilities, because NATO is very preoccupied with the Article 5 and the territorial defense of the alliance territory. So I think this is also one important element, the crisis management capabilities, and that's obviously something where the EU has a track record as well.
Please, go ahead.
If I may add to that, two very concrete outcomes that would add to NATO's strength by the EU. One concrete example is the military mobility. We definitely need more investment in our infrastructure when it comes to military mobility, and NATO is not in place to implement that, let alone to finance that. But the EU is an entity that could strive for better military mobility. I was observing the steadfast defender NATO exercise in the north, in the high north, and I saw it with my own eyes that there are great need of more investment in the military mobility. I think it would be a good idea for the new Commission to propose a military mobility directive in order to guide the member states in their investments to better enhance military mobility connections. The second issue is the European North, the high North, and I mean especially the Arctic. Now that Finland and Sweden are both in NATO and we are both in the European Union, that is a serious strength for both of the institutions, because for China and Russia in particular, the Arctic is one of their core strategic interests. And by having the Arctic nations, Finland and Sweden, in the EU and in NATO, that would be a big asset to us in order to safeguard the very critical sea lanes, the sea routes, the northern sea route, and also the critical infrastructure that we have in the high north in the Arctic.
Tutte, you had talked about the fact that it's almost a bipartisan effort in terms of pressuring or encouraging Europe to do more in terms of defense spending. But of course, former President Trump has shown a real antipathy towards the NATO alliance. And I'm curious to hear from you, Sirpa, how Europe should prepare for the potential return of a Trump administration when it comes to NATO and when it comes to Ukraine.
We have done it. We should have done it much earlier on. And you remember in those days we all were kids almost. We talked about the Western European Defense Union. So we know already for a long time what needs to happen, but somehow because of the political dilemmas we didn't do it. And I think Chancellor Merkel said it very well when Trump was elected on his first term, that Europe needs to take its fate on its own hands. And this is a very serious point. It's a bit, would we sort of seize our own army in Finland and just rely on the European forces? Probably not. And why do we have this kind of over-reliance on the USA, knowing it has its own politics? And I think that this is a permanent issue that we should bear in mind, and that goes to our, for example, own production and development, and not over-relying, that goes in Finland as well, on buying from the USA. This is a strategic long-term mistake. And Trump, of course, tells the story, okay, what could happen with his agreement with Putin, and I don't even want to go there, what it could mean. So this is an important point. But let me comment two other points very quickly. On Tytti, about this Arctic, yes, I think that we should take this Arctic much more seriously. It's almost a game lost for the Europe because we haven't focused enough on defending the non-allied, non-military role of the Arctic. We could have done more there and on the sustainability issues, and now the race is almost done between China and Russia, and it's very difficult for us. Then about the military mobility, EU has a program on this. At least we should have a bigger program like the at.to. Your idea about the directive might be pretty useful. Certainly we would focus on it. And then on the exact question about the EU, our own defense and NATO, I think that there's so much unnecessary unclarity about it. The police is one force, and the army is one force. You do not send the army on Kuusamo hot dog kiosk booth if there's some guys fighting there. It just doesn't make any sense. Of course you need the police forces. And then again, if it is a local small issue, border issue, it is the national army. Mm-hmm. But then again, when it is a NATO conflict, it's worldwide escalating conflict with serious consequences. Think twice, should NATO by this time should have started a war with Russia in Ukraine? What about the Georgia? What about our borders? And don't you think that Russia knows this? So we are sort of naked sort of with our over-reliance on NATO on this. We need this, in quotes, polis. This means the local level, regional level, European capacity to act and act soon as a deterrence, because NATO deterrence doesn't work, because everybody knows NATO is not going to attack Moscow, because what happens in bombing the Kyiv, as we have seen. And then that sort of underlines the deterrence and the capacity and the importance why we would need to have the European defense. That means the troops, this means the procurement, this means the production, this means together the training. And of course we do the procurement and practice together with the NATO. It needs to be aligned. But the capacity to act needs to be in Europe. And yes, they are defense. And then the rest and the broader security is EU. And this is pretty clear if we just think it and communicate it very clearly.
Thought you wanted to respond, it looked like.
Yeah, sorry, Aku, for stealing your airtime here. No, it feels like one needs to start to sing here, or I mean the choir here. It sounded like music in our ears, obviously. And just to underline and to continue on the point on military mobility, we would be interested to see how the Council would approach a potential military mobility directive, but we would certainly welcome a proposal like that. But just to inform us, I mean, indeed, military mobility is part of the 10T program, and because of the current situation, we upfronted all the money. So, in fact, military mobility funds are already used for this period because we upfronted everything. And should the member states agree to it, I'm sure we would push more into it. The military mobility requirements, they were NATO requirements, or they are NATO requirements, just to point out. So it's really one-to-one. We did not invent our own. And on the force structure and how we support, that's why it's so important that we support currently at least, and why not in the future, the member states' capabilities, because the member states are fundamentally the ones who are responsible for the security on their sovereign soils, even if they are NATO allies. It starts always with them, so that's why the support goes to the member states, which then use one set of forces maybe to nationally and for Europe and NATO, if that would be the case. And now I leave it over maybe for others. Sorry.
Thank you. Aku, would you like to weigh in on the NATO question?
Yeah, sure. I think the big question here, obviously, after Finland joining NATO, Sweden now a year after us, it's a big change nationally, from the national perspective as well. We are no longer only protecting our own borders, we are now protecting our allies as well. And I'm a bit worried with, is the situational awareness of what's going on in Europe the same in each country? Like, the motto of EU, united in diversity. Does this unity also cover defense and security? I don't believe it is the situation at the moment. And what can we do about this is a big topic, because we can have the programs, we can have the ideas, and we can have some money as well. But if we lack the ability to make decisions, like we can see that is concretely happening with the supports towards Ukraine, for example, where Mr. Orban is being a bit of a problem. And it's not just one country and one leader. It might be other countries and other leaders after the elections. So I think this is one of the key issues that we need to solve, is how can we see and how can we find a unified path forward with these defense and security matters.
Please.
I think it requires political leadership. If there's the will, there's the way, and I call for political leadership. We have to stay united and understand what is at stake. It is our European model of life, how we live, our rule of law, our democracy, our equality, our gender equality, and so on. But leadership is not enough. We also need structures, and therefore I firmly support the Commission President's idea of having a new portfolio in the next Commission. Defence Commissioner would be a great idea, a very needed idea, and also it means that we have to renew our council formations. We need to have a defence council, which is a sovereign council, not linked to the foreign policy council. So decision-making, structures and leadership.
So does this also mean that now we are ready to move towards qualified majority decision-making?
If you ask me, definitely.
Excellent.
Very briefly on the strategic cultures, I think this is of course one of the academic research topics as well, and I think this years of crisis and especially the Russian aggression, there's also been some developments. So some of the countries which are very far away from Russia, I'm referring to Spain for instance, in their public opinions they see Russia as #1 threat for Spanish national security. Portugal is highly active in supporting Ukraine and the EU action, NATO collaboration in that respect as well. So it's not just the eastern flank, there are also some developments going on. But then of course I think it's important to understand that of course different parts of Europe will have different kind of security interests and risks and they see threats differently. So then, of course, we come into this question that how to bring these together. I think there are good attempts. A strategic compass agreed by the European Union. There are a lot in there. Of course, NATO has a new strategic concept, which also brings in kind of a common threat perception. And of course, these processes needs to be strengthened. From a researcher's perspective, often these take place in a very high level. And the foreign security policy is something which is discussed behind the closed doors with certain experts and certain people. So of course this is also something that it should be sort of, should go down to the streets and events like this and other places where people can also discuss their views and worries about the security situation.
So you wanted to respond?
Indeed, and it goes a little bit into the diversity of the EU, while we still should be totally united, and going a little bit into the nitty-gritty. So what do we support in the defense industry strategy? And while we all know that it's best to do as a Europe, as a whole approach, why does the program that's also proposed there make it possible to do in a combination of 2 or only 3 member states? What's this? Why aren't we requiring that it's always for EU27? Well, it's exactly because of the fact that we have a little bit of a different geography, which is very much interlinked to our distance to Russia or the closest Chinese activities or then some other. And we have seen that that's the unity. We agree that we can be regionally different technically when we develop matters. And if there are commonalities, then the commonalities can be EU-wide. And indeed, there are certain capabilities that are broader than a single set of 3 member states, for example.
Serbo, please.
I would like to continue a bit from Juha's point that we have a diverse security strategies and interest. I claim yes and no. It is a bit the same. We have very much different issues with agriculture. Still we have a common agricultural policy with a bit of tweaking when it is in Romania or in Finland. We actually do have the same biodiversity in different parts of the Europe, even though the vegetation of fauna is different and the application is different. And yes, we do have more forests in Finland and we need to act more here. But yes, then again, when it comes to climate change, the poles have more coal and it's harder for them. And still we are sort of moving together. And I think that we should move up to this point in defense too. If Europe is threat, if any one of us is threat, it's the threat of all of us. So our interest is Moldova and the border between Greece and Turkey. Our interest is Polish interest, and it is Portuguese interest, and it's Portuguese interest what happens in the Arctic. And this is not yet the mindset. And why I wanted to raise this is that I really don't think that this is going to change fast enough between the discussions with the prime ministers and this upgrowing nationalism. What we need to do is we need to talk to you. We need to talk with the people. You need to talk with other people and say, look, this is European people's interest. This is our security. This is what you need to kick your governments to move forward. It is not this kind of a theoretical virtual game what we always play in member states. Oh, this is this Eurocrats, and oh, this is again this federalism, yeek, proceeding, and then our good ministers and our good countries, and we are capable of doing everything in the world by ourselves on the other side. Just people should say, and the media, and there I put a heavy weight, cut the crap. Let's start talking about the real thing, what makes people more secure or less secure, be it biodiversity or defense or the other fields.
I think we.
Sorry about getting a bit emotional.
I'm glad.
It's the word, Sirpa, the word is solidarity. We need European solidarity.
Well, that sounds like a very good note to end on then. I think the idea of communicating the urgency to the European public has perhaps never been more important. So thank you to our esteemed group of panelists for this very thoughtful and thought-provoking discussion. We invite all of our participants here in Helsinki to join us for a refreshment break and then to come back at 5:15 local time for our second panel. Thank you very much. Thank you. For those of you just joining online, my name is Chris Alessi, and I'm the editor-in-chief of the Parliament magazine. Thank you for joining us for this Finnish edition of our series, Road to the European Elections, which is co-organized by the Parliament magazine with the European Movement International, along with the kind support of the European Parliament Liaison Office here in Finland. Following our first panel of the day, The Future of European Security and Defense Policy, we're back for round two. And we have another impressive group of panelists here to join us for this one, a European Union fit for purpose. In short, we'll be asking what's next for the EU's defense framework as the bloc looks to expand its military capabilities and ready itself to confront a myriad of global threats, including, as discussed in the first panel, right at the border. I'd first like to introduce Heidi Hautala, who is a vice president of the European Parliament and has already informed me because she won't be running in the next elections, she can speak freely. So we'll look forward to that. Then we have Niels Torvalds, who is a member of parliament and sits on the budgetary committee. Toti Sivonen, who is the executive director of European Movement Finland. Tune Karelanian, who's a researcher at the Finnish Institute of International Affairs. And last but not least, Nini Nora, citizen ambassador from Finland on the Conference of the Future of Europe. I'd also like to remind participants both on site and online that you may ask questions on Slido by scanning that QR code or by typing in that hashtag number 1427067. For those that asked questions in the first panel, apologies, the device was apparently not connected to the internet. But we will be up and running for this one, so please do feel free to ask questions and we'll try to get to them before the end. So, following the unveiling of the new defense industrial strategy earlier this month, Commissioner Breton said that, quote, defense must remain a national responsibility, and that the new strategy is, quote, not about changing treaties, it's about working together within the framework of existing treaties, end quote. So I'd like to put the question to each of you, how much should defense remain a national responsibility, and is building up the EU's military-industrial complex enough, or are treaty changes required at the European level in order to strengthen the continent's defense capabilities? Heidi, I'd love it if you'd begin.
Yeah, thank you very much, and thanks for the Parliament magazine for showing up here in Helsinki together with the European Movement International. Well, I think that we have many tools, as we have heard from the first panel, to build this military-industrial complex at European level. The instruments are being shaped, and the financing is looked at very carefully now. I think we are taking a leap towards common procurement, common defense capabilities. But I still believe that, which was actually one of the messages of the previous panel, that by far most EU member states are also NATO member states. I think there are now just 4, Ireland, Austria, Cyprus and Malta, which are not. And there's always a consideration to their special status. And it has not prevented the EU member states to work also very closely with NATO. But so NATO remains the collective military defense organization. But as I think the previous panel also showed, that there are limits to what NATO can do. So what we need to do at European level is this comprehensive security concept. And there, Sirpa Pietikäinen is not anymore here, but I was thinking about a major civic movement which was a revolutionary organization before the Finnish independence, Marttaliike, because in fact what we need for that is a whole of society approach, and let's say those movements who are thinking about resilience of our everyday lives. So, but even there I think that we have a lot of legal space, legal base to act. But then what is missing, and where I think we need treaty changes, is that we cannot be a credible actor with even close to credible defense as EU, as a European pillar of NATO, unless we are able to do foreign and security policy in the global framework in a more efficient way as today. And there the treaty changes come in, I think. That we need to be able to do away with the principle of unanimity. We need to see that not one member state is stopping us. There's been some very uncomfortable moments, like when Hungary said that actually we have to take Patriarch Kirill out of the list of people sanctioned because of involvement in the Ukraine war. So this kind of things should not happen anymore, and that's where we need treaty changes. And one last thing is that you remember when Ursula von der Leyen spoke about enlargement, the EU beyond 2030, she made it very clear that it cannot happen without major changes in EU decision-making, and that's certainly true. It was an interesting remark from the previous panel about the 2004 enlargement, that NATO enlargement did not take place then, but EU enlargement did. So now the question for us, I think, is also that what are we doing about the possibility to support Ukraine's membership, not only in the EU, but also in NATO? The same will go for Moldova. The next in line is Armenia, totally disillusioned with Russia. So we have big questions. Some treaty change is needed, but not exactly for the military-industrial complex, I would say.
Okay, great. Thanks for starting us off. Niels, please.
Oh, thank you. Well, I'll start by telling you a very well-kept secret. The secret is that politics is extremely opportunistic. If you had listened to the narrative in Finnish politics some 3 years ago, people would probably have spoken about the peace dividend. You remember the peace dividend? Almost every member state of the European Union actually cut down the expenditure on military. That was the peace dividend. There was actually one member state that didn't do it, and that happened to be Finland. Why? Not because politicians here would have been more intelligent than the rest of the bunch, but we had a sort of army leadership who had taken the responsibility already after 1944. So we have kept our resources on an acceptable level. The rest haven't done it. You probably remember what happened with the Dutch tanks. The Dutch tanks, not the tanks, the tanks were actually sold to Finland for a cheap sum of euros because they thought, we don't need them anymore. What did the Germans do? They got rid of the conscription system. That was what the Swedes had done. So we had an immense illusion in Europe. And all of a sudden, on the 24th of February 2022, we also all of a sudden woke up and now try to pedal back. And my greatest fear is that when we are trying to find financing for the member states and their armies, those who got the peace dividend will get the money. And those who did what should be done, sort of Finland, the intelligent answer from the Commission will be, oh, you have everything in order, you don't need it. So I think we are up for a really interesting fight, and we should start it today. And the future doesn't look too bright. We have a German election 24 and a French election 27. If both goes wrong, then we won't have very much of EU left to fight about. And then just last provocation under these circumstances, we actually don't have a leadership in the European Union. If anybody of you have the illusion that the different DGs are led by the commissioners, then it's high time to wake up, because that's not the case. We don't have leadership in the Commission. When we grill, or say that we grill the new members of the Commission in the Parliament, we don't ask them, do you know what leadership is? If we would have asked them if they know, we would probably have, if they had been sort of honest, they would have said, no, I don't know what leadership is about. And that's the real problem we have in front of us. Thanks.
Thank you.
Yeah, on the Commissioner Bretton's words, I think I would agree with him to an extent. I think that defense is principally a national responsibility, but perhaps not solely. And what I mean by this is that national armies are the backbone of defense. Without them, we don't really have anything. And then when we have our national armies working together, then of course we can enhance our capabilities and be stronger and better together. Now, of course, on the EU level, there's many different areas where cooperation is especially important. On the last panel, there was talk about the joint procurement, for example. So areas such as those. And on the boosting up the military-industrial complex in the EU, I think it is maybe good enough for now. I mean, it was just a few years ago that we sort of realized that we've been lacking in this department for far too long. And only recently the work has begun, so I think we shouldn't really lose focus on that. At the same time, we have to take into account the fact that it's ever-evolving security landscape that we're currently living in. And as such, we can't really be sure of what tomorrow will bring. So as for the treaty changes or treaty amendments go, I think we need to be ready for many different trajectories, many of which would require further integration in all matters of security and defense.
Thank you.
All right, thank you so much. Okay, first of all, I think it's good to mention as a background that, of course, since NATO and EU share most of the member states, NATO remains as the backbone of European defense. And the EU, it does not make sense to overlap too much. The EU's added value remains in human security, comprehensive security, as Heidi Hautala already brought up, in being able to regulate, to do capability development, capacity building, capability development that also supports NATO, of course, or other flexible defense cooperation frameworks in Europe. At the same time, of course, this war has shown that we need some strategic autonomy. We need the EU to be able to sometimes act also without NATO, also outside its area, of course. For instance, in cases such as Afghanistan, where we evacuate quickly or need to go to a crisis or a conflict setting, we need some own capabilities to establish a level of security there. And the recent developments, of course, contribute to that end. Then the third point that I want to make is that I see it is really important that we maintain the flexibility of the EU defense instruments. And I, of course, mean that since member states have quite special requirements, of course, very different national perspectives and national interest perceptions, but also, for example, some have a neutral status still. It's really important for the EU's ability to act that we maintain this flexibility. For instance, now when we have been responding to Russia's war of aggression, where, of course, NATO framework has been too sensitive to use in a very visible way, and we have been using the EPF, the European Peace Facility, for example, to fund the weapon deliveries. It has been really crucial that there is the constructive abstention mechanism inbuilt in these mechanisms, so that states that cannot participate in the defense cooperation, or in this case, of course, it's more about funding military activities, remains there. I think I'll end there.
Thank you. It is very easy to agree with the previous panelists and for the majority of the points. For me, at least, the European security future is a future where every stage, every level of governance has a meaningful purpose. And I also think it is the kind of future that the people can easily get behind of. What I mean by this is that while we need to improve the European security competencies, we should not forget the importance of the national competencies either. For example, in the national level, we're still going to need strong national defense. I might even suggest military conscription for the whole age group, both sexes, and the incentives need to also be local or national, in the sense that every state needs to meet the investment criteria, the 2% for NATO. If we were to collectivize that, I don't think it would be very healthy for the economic side of things. As for the European level, we have a question of rearranging, reforming our governance structure, and also thinking about how our pre-existing models of governance, for example, PESCO, the European Defence Fund, the Common Security and Defence Policy, how are these going to fit the new framework? And we ought to avoid all sorts of duplications and overlapping, like it was said before. And as for NATO, NATO is indeed most important, but the reason why we need to develop European security competencies is obviously because we know that the US is unpredictable, and we know that they don't have all of our geopolitical interests in mind as we do. We have already seen an outcry for lessening the support for Ukraine from the US public. Certain politicians have also pointed out such ideas, and you can kind of sympathize with that. For many of those people, it's just a war in the European soil that has nothing to do with them. But in NATO, I think it is important that us, as the European Union, we make it very clear that this isn't just about Ukraine or isn't just about Europe. It's about a conflict between the democratic world order and between authoritarianism. And that is why it at least ought to be an interest for the United States as well. And I think within NATO, what the EU needs to prioritize is stopping the infighting and the blaming of who is doing what and who isn't. It's very important that all of us meet those standards, but NATO, I think, is all about credibility. And if the United States and the European Union fail to come to a conclusion that feels fair and efficient for all of the parties involved, I think it is going to lessen our credibility. And this is, I think, the prime of risk for any kind of conflict that might actually pose threat to the world order. The only way to prevent it is to ensure that the credibility doesn't hinder. And to very briefly summarize, as for the treaty change, I think we are often approaching it in a wrong way. Some people think that treaty change is the end of the world, that we shouldn't do it. I think it's quite unrealistic because treaty change is going to be inevitable. It's always been part of the European history. But some people also find it as this kind of magical cure for all of our problems, which also isn't true. It is simply a new legal framework that is going to present new problems, and we will have to deal with those problems as well. But in the context of European security and defence policy, the fundamental issue that was already pointed out is, can we find one voice in these political questions, and can we commit to that voice? And with the current unanimity form of voting, it might actually be impossible. I don't think we should prioritize treaty change for the sake of treaty change, but we should ask, what is our strategy? What is our vision? And if realizing that vision requires treaty change, we should be open to it. Yes.
Thank you. Lots to think about there. In terms of the existing legal framework that we have now, though, the EU's latest step in developing the common security and defense policy. Can you hear me? I feel like it's not on.
Something just happened to the microphone. Maybe the person is there.
Okay. Sure. Is that better? Can you hear me? Okay. So I was saying that in terms of the existing legal framework, the EU's latest step in developing the common security and defense policy came in 2022 with the launch of the so-called strategic compass, which includes the establishment, as you know, of an EU rapid deployment capacity of up to 5,000 troops and the expectation for live exercises at land and sea. With the war in Ukraine now in its third year, is there the political will to make good on the promises put forward in the strategic compass? Would you like to jump in on that, Tune?
Sure. I think we have actually taken quite many steps to the direction that the strategic compass set. And of course, the strategic compass is already like a implementing document that reflects the strategic objectives that were set in the global strategy 2016. So there is a quite long-term development, of course. what I see most significant there is, of course, I would say that we have been able to also implement those tools that we have, or to take into action those tools that we have established. And now I'm of course referring, for example, to the battle groups that never have been used, but now, for example, the European Peace Facility that I already mentioned has been used to a significant extent to respond to the war. And maybe it's just one thing I still want to complement what I was saying earlier about the flexibility, is that it's also that the member states can contribute to the implementation of these tools and the use of these tools in different roles. And here, for example, the European Peace Facility allows some member states to pay for the pot of the European Peace Facility, and others to use the pot to actually deliver weapons to Ukraine. And I think this is quite interesting, since it kind of allows member states in their different capacities to be useful for the joint defense effort, or the joint efforts in the European security and defense policies. For example, of course, Germany is the key contributor to the pot, while then Eastern European states have been the quickest to use the pot to deliver weapons. I know I'm now all the time talking about the European Peace Facility. I promise I stop here.
I tried to tell you that there is actually no leadership in the European Union. And it's of course a provocation, but it's also true. And as long as we don't have a real leadership, and it actually goes for both the Commission and the Council, we won't be able to solve the problems. Just to give you a very small example, and my friend Sedalov might be of a different point of view. Do you think a member of the Commission is actually leading the DGs? Or is it the other way around, that he is led by the nose by the DGs? And as far as I've seen during my 12 years there, a commissioner is not leading it. There is probably one exception. Franz Timmermans did it. Then do we agree with him or not? That's a different question. But we have very little leadership. If we have little leadership, then we have even less money. Go back to the budgetary truths. Germany is providing 20% of the EU budget. Do you really, in your fantasy, think that Germany is able to go over that 20%, or given even more money? You can put up your hand if you believe it. There is something in German legislation, and it's in the fundamental law, that is called Schuldenbremse. And the Schuldenbremse means that the government for the moment being, the German government for the moment being, doesn't have the money. In all previous histories of European Union, the deal was that the German will pay, and they were so deeply embarrassed by the Second World War that they paid. Now they don't have the money because of the energy policy and because of the German car industry is going sort of backwards. So you won't find money. Then you go to France and ask if France would like to pay. France debt to GDP is 110%. There is no possibility for them to find the money. So if something is going to be done, it's going to be done with some special arrangement where we take even more loans on EU.
Heidi, I saw you wanted to weigh in.
Yeah, well, what Tune said, I think, is really, for me, quite crucial to understand, is that the instruments can be used in a flexible way, because the member states have so many different approaches, even the status vis-à-vis military alignment, as we have discussed earlier. So if we look at the strategic compass, I think we can even go back to 1999, the Helsinki headlines, where these principles have already been declared, but the moment of truth probably came after the fully fledged invasion of Ukraine by Russia. So I think we are now at the threshold where these things are going to be implemented. Concerning the support to Ukraine, there are so many different ways to support Ukraine now. I'm very pleased to hear that the summit this week, this end of week, I think yesterday, came finally to the conclusion that they will be able to take the profits from the 300 billion euro savings of deposits of Russian, I think it's Russian central bank, right? For the benefit of Ukraine. So it shows that after a lot of going forth and back, such a decision has been taken, even if it still has some legal questions. Could Russian Federation then challenge the European Union in front of an international court? It's not excluded, but the situation has so many risks that I'm glad that this decision now has been taken, and I understand that during the next 4 years that could release about 28 billion euros for supporting weapons to Ukraine. So that's one example of the creativity, and not everybody agreed to start with. Then there are other means. Now yesterday also what our heads of state discussed is that we need to change the statutes of the European Investment Bank so that it will not only be able to support projects, innovation, development of let's say, the military and defense side, but also perhaps to finance actual procurement and deposits, delivery of weapons. So there are many things going on, and I just mentioned two. So I believe that the variety of the ways in which the EU and its member states can support. So I also don't think that it's a very good thing to France is not doing this, Germany is not doing that, Finland is perhaps not doing another thing. So they all do what they can, and there is, at the end of the day, I think there is an agreement that this is an existential threat that we now have. With Russia threatening to go further. You saw maybe that Putin organized this youth festival I think in Sochi a week ago, and one of the slogans was that Russia knows no limits. Well, I mean, that's very clear.
Nini, did you want to add something to that?
Yes, I hope. Yeah, the mic is working. I wanted to elaborate on what Torvald said about the funding aspect of the European security future, and particularly address two elements that I think are key. First of all, how to fund these ambitious plans for European security and defense reforms and improvements. And the second one being rebuilding Ukraine. Both of these are going to be incredibly costly affairs. And there has been different suggestions about the funding. Some people have even suggested some kind of security and defense bonds, more loans. And while loaning isn't always bad by itself, it is certainly quite risky during a time where we have not experienced significant economic growth in the past years in the European Union. So the matter of economic growth is something that has been discussed in multiple occasions, in multiple contexts, regarding multiple subjects. And I think it's truly also part of our resilience and our security in the future. Can we compete in technology? Can we compete in innovation? Are we reduced to plain consumers, consuming products from China, consuming products from the United States? I think it all comes back to it. Are we going to be competitive in the future? And thus, can we afford these security and defense investments that we are now planning to do? I certainly hope that we are going to. But again, like it was stated in the previous panel, security and resilience are quite multifaceted. It isn't just about military and weaponry. We also have to consider, how do we turn the course of the current economic development? How do we encourage growth? How do we encourage innovation?
Thank you. Toti, I'd like to ask you to pick up a thread there, and that's Eurobonds. There seems to be an increasing appetite, or at least increasing openness for a concept that would not have been on the table even a couple of months ago. What's your take on that?
Well, from a Finnish perspective, I don't see it happening anytime soon. There's been a lot of talk about Eurobonds over the years, and usually the Finnish reaction towards these is pretty dry, I think I could say. But these are unprecedented times that we are living, so I think we do need to look into these new methods of financing our initiatives. And in this sense, I do see that Eurobonds could be one of the alternatives that we might take in that regard.
Well, I'm probably not totally of the same opinion, because we need to do it without having too many, too big debt. We see already in Finland, and we don't need to go very much further to see that we are always up to here in debt. The problem is that we are trying to solve this problem by spoiling the European Union. You saw what happened in Germany. The German state paid 600 million for a battery factory. And that's a sure way of spoiling the common market. If we start sort of financing, state financing the economy with borrowed money, then you can understand that for small countries depending on export like Finland or Sweden, this is the end of the road. And that's again sort of we are, as I said before, we have no leadership, we have no money, and we have a lot of naivety. We are extremely naive. And I give you a very good example. Usually we think that the wake-up call came on the 24th of February 2022. That was a very late wake-up call. My wake-up call came literally on the 9th of September 1999 in Moscow, when a house was blown up. I stood at the ruins of that house in the early morning hours on the night of September. It's a cover-up. All the papers of what happened are named secret for the next 20 or 30 years. And I'll tell you another small secret. Vladimir Putin was named Russian premier on the 8th of August the same year. And he is the culprit of this crime also. And that was the real wake-up call for me. So we have in our neighborship, we have a guy who is willing and able to kill his own citizens just to be able to start a new war, because then he went to Chechnya. With a neighbor like that, we need to wake up, and therefore I say we need leadership, we need new money, and we have to get rid of all the illusions.
Tune, I saw your hand up. Is Niels correct that there is a leadership vacuum and that there's too much naivete when it comes to Russia or other threats around the globe?
Well, I think he's certainly right there, and I think we have recently seen attempts from Paris to fulfill that vacuum with some proposals. What I wanted to mention still is that, or somehow take one step back as a researcher and note that what we are actually discussing here is basically militarization of the European Union, which is a civilian actor, or which was known previously as a civilian actor. And I'm not saying this as a critique, but this is just something we need to acknowledge and then also ask ourselves as voters in the European Parliament elections, and also as others contributing to the discussion, that with what values are we doing this development? I mean, this also is an opportunity that for the European member states to act more with the European values when we act militarily, for example, like outside our area, but also when it comes to capability development, to cherish the European values, since even though we are now developing European defense capabilities and military capabilities in this geopolitical context, we are still like the value-oriented union, I guess, and that of course should be reflected in how we develop our instruments, when we do capacity building. The European Union has so many, like for example, its crisis management operations are more and more often about capacity building. So we should make sure that we follow our values there. We monitor in what way are those capacities then used. Are they democratically controlled? Is there accountability? Are our weapons used for human rights violations, for example? So I think this is also an opportunity for the European states to cherish these values when we invest in defense capabilities.
Thank you. Heidi, I do want to turn to you, but I also want to use this opportunity to take a question from the audience, which is, I think, in line with some of the points you brought up and part of the conversation around values. And the question is, when is it time for a European army? Heidi, do you want to weigh in on that?
No, I don't think it's going to be a European army. I think there's been quite a lot of description of what we should aim at. It's still a compilation of national defense, joined hopefully at the NATO level, and then seeing that we are equipped to do the procurement and development at the European level, combining also pooling our forces. And so I think I can't see the European army in the making.
Nini?
Thank you. Yes, I actually couldn't agree more. And this was an interesting concept that I encountered quite recently, that we ought to differentiate between the ideas of a EU army and the army of Europeans. We already have these said battle groups that Tuna was referencing to, and like she also said, they are quite underutilized. So perhaps using this structure, we could come to some kind of a decision where both the national security competences are maintained, but we also have defense capacity in the European level. So, and I think it's also going to be more democratically feasible, because I think it would be very difficult to convince people of the European Union with very different histories, different cultures, different interpretations of conflicts to become completely reliant on a centralized military force. But this all comes down to the foundational question: can we find a united voice in foreign and security policy? Because as for now, thanks to the unanimity, we have not deployed those battle groups, not once, I think. So to discuss that first, are we ready to change this principle? Then I suppose we could, largen the question to consider also the possibility of an army or armies or enhanced battle groups of Europeans, but this would not come at the expense of national security defense competencies.
Toti, did you want to add anything to that?
Yeah, I agree with the previous comments. I don't really see it being feasible to make up a European army anytime soon. I think it's going to rely on the national armies, as Heidi said, at least for the future that I can see. That's not to say that we can't cooperate within our national armies and enhance our capabilities that way, but I don't see a EU army being a reality anytime soon.
I'm going to say something really shocking. No, Donald Trump was right on one thing when he said that the NATO member states have to step up to the requirements. Before they have done that, we actually can't speak about armies in the different member states. So the first thing NATO has to do is to ensure that every member state actually does what they have been obliged to do for about 30 years and haven't done so far. And saying that it took, during the last 30 years, they have been asked to do it and they haven't done it, that actually shows that it's not going to be very easy. to get to that level. But if we don't get to that level, then we don't have the national armies with capacities we're going to need. And then we have the second issue. How many member states are actually on the political level ready to say, yeah, we put boots on the ground? You remember, I think it was 10 days ago when a certain slightly emperor-like president of the French Republic said that he could think of putting boots on the ground. Oh, what happened? Everybody said, oh, no, 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 no. So I don't think we are ready to think even in those terms. If we aren't ready to think in those terms, what the hell are we actually speaking about? Then we are speaking about daydreams. Well, I think the French president was actually right to put the question. And the answer he got was actually wrong.
Well, let me put that question to the rest of the panel. What do you think of President Macron's comments about the possibility of either NATO or European boots on the ground in Ukraine?
I don't want to waste too much time on it. I think Niels said it.
Yeah, I would have to agree with Niels as well on that one. I don't see it happening anytime soon, but it was a bold question from Emmanuel Macron to ask.
Was he serious or was he just trying to provoke?
You'd have to ask Macron that. That I can't say.
Yeah, maybe what I was thinking when I heard these comments was that or what I was asking myself was that was the purpose of this proposal actually to build stronger, more coherent support for Ukraine, or just to demonstrate leadership in Europe? Since, of course, if we want to respond, if we want to support Ukraine, we actually need coordinated and coherent action, at least taking into account the different perspective in different European capitals, acknowledging the reservation that Germany has, especially for this kind of initiatives.
I could criticize Macron for a lot of things, but he certainly has no lack of vision. So even if his proposals might be quite preposterous, to be honest, we have been talking about the lack of leadership, and I wish that perhaps people with more sensible ideas were to come forward and be as bold as to propose something, well, perhaps more pragmatic and doable, but still with proactivity, shall we say. But no, I don't agree with the proposal that he put forward.
Thank you. In our last few minutes, I just wanted to quickly touch on the issue of enlargement, which of course has come to the fore again over the past couple of years. Tune, how can enlargement be a tool for security and defense? And in what way do you see this round of enlargement as an asset for Europe's security goals?
Well, of course, in the thinking in Brussels and in many European capitals, enlargement is seen as a tool to increase stability and democracy, and in that way, it's kind of positive peace in Europe. At the same time, when it comes to Eastern neighborhood, in particular Ukraine and Moldova, we were not ready to offer them the European perspective before because we were afraid it would provoke Russia. Especially Paris and Berlin were afraid that such enlargement of the Union towards the East would provoke Russia, and in that way European enlargement was prevented by the fear of a war or aggression or a worsening of relationship. Now that we are equipping Ukraine, building its capacities in the war, I see it extremely important that we are strongly committed to strengthening democracy in Ukraine, fighting corruption in Ukraine, since I think that's what is needed, what makes our defense support more legitimate. In the end, I, however, do not see that Ukraine will become a democratic European state if it does not win the war. So there is a strong interconnection between these two objectives, making Ukraine a democratic European state and supporting its defense. The other, we cannot have one without the other in a way. So we need democratic support for a good governance in Ukraine in order for it to succeed in the defense support, and it needs to win the war in order to become an EU member.
Yeah, I think Juha Jokela said something really important in the first panel. He spoke about this grey zone. I think Finland assumed for quite many decades that there's a zone between the West and the Soviet Union, then later Russia, and I think many in the Ukrainian society understood quite early that they don't want to be in that, even if there perhaps even was not such a grey zone, because there was a choice, and they chose for Europe and they chose for the West, and we have to support them in all their endeavors, and that's what we're doing at very many levels. There's quite a lot happening now in the accession, and I've been involved in the environmental consequences of the war, and we see now how much the support to Ukraine in this situation of war is also linked to their accession process and to overcome. By the way, there was the last of these environmental war crimes happened this morning when the Russian attacked a hydropower station in Dnipro. So these go on all the time, and there's at very many levels. And there's also the accountability issue, which is the EU is very much involved in that, to get the war crimes and crimes against humanity, maybe even at the end of the day, the crime of aggression to accountability. And the environment is an important part of that.
Well, in European security, we tried the cordon sanitaire already once, and it didn't work. So I think from moral point of view and economical point of view, Ukraine should become a member as soon as possible. Saying as soon as possible doesn't mean tomorrow or even during the next mandate of the parliament. I think we are speaking about something beyond 2027. But the implications are huge, because you probably remember that the Ukrainians said, well, we don't need any support for our agriculture. So the CAP, after Ukraine joining, the CAP is dead. After that, we are going to renationalize agricultural policies in Europe, which is actually freeing up a lot of the European budget, which could be used for better ends. So I think actually taking Ukraine on board is a very good idea in economic terms and in moral terms.
Yeah, I agree, and I think we should view enlargement as opposed to a tool, more of like a necessity, an absolute necessity that we have to get on with. And while we do not wish for a too rapid of an enlargement, I mean, we have to accelerate. We don't have the luxury to stall in this regard any longer, and the process has been quite lengthy for many of the candidate countries, so in this sense as well. But I mean, the baseline here, I think, is that if the EU doesn't enlarge towards the east, then Russia will continue to try to expand towards the west. So that provides us with the necessity for the future round of enlargement.
Final word, Nini.
Okay, final word. Yes, we must be both strategic and very decisive about enlargement, specifically for those reasons. Unfortunately, I believe we'll live in a world where we are, again, discussing spheres of influence. But I also believe we must make these decisions of enlargement with clear heads, that we must understand that if we don't adhere to our criteria, for example, the Copenhagen criteria, if we don't adhere to our core principles and core values, those are going to be problems for the future. And I think they're going to be many times bigger than if we stay rational and clear-headed whilst making these decisions right now. I think what we are afraid of is that should we not enlarge ourselves, the sphere of Russian influence is going to become bigger. But if we are to renounce our principles and our criteria prematurely, I believe we are inviting what we are afraid of, what we are fighting against within our borders, if we are too premature about it. So to help these candidate countries to achieve those criteria, to become democratic, to become accepted according to those criteria, I believe that is the best way to go. It is indeed going to be a difficult process, but still I think it is possible and something that we should strive towards.
Well, we'll need to leave it there, but that's a great note to end on. And I just wanted to thank all of our participants here in Helsinki and online for joining us for this panel and our first panel. I'd also like to thank all of our speakers for their contribution. And last but not least, to thank our co-organizer, the European Movement International, as well as the European Parliament Liaison Office in Finland, for all their support in planning this event. Thank you very much.